Hello guys, welcome back again. This is my 2012 Halloween watch list in which I show you the movies I'll be watching in preparation of Halloween. What I'm going to do for the next few days will be something kind of special inside of this very specific series. But what we're going to talk about is what I'm going to call the Franchise Fest, which is going to be a few days in a row dealing with just a certain movie and its sequels. Now, a forewarning right up here at front. If you've never seen these movies and you plan to see them at any point, there will be spoilers throughout. And I will warn you at the beginning of each of these that that is the case. Anytime you're dealing with a movie and you're dealing with sequels, it's almost impossible not to talk about how something ends so that you can set up how something else begins. So instead of trying to worry about not having spoilers and explain each sequel as it goes along, I'm just going to tell you right up front, I assume that you've seen these movies. If you haven't, of course, like I said, definitely go check them out first beforehand. This will be your point to jump out before I begin. And the series I'll be talking about is, of course, Halloween. So at this point, there will be spoilers from here on. This movie was a movie done in 1978 by John Carpenter. He was approached on this movie telling him basically how they wanted it, and John Carpenter kind of came in after the fact. But what he did with that movie as far as how he designed it, especially the music itself, the directing, the pacing, all that stuff, is very, very signature John Carpenter. So even though this wasn't his initial idea to make this movie, I definitely can tell you that it would not be the same without John Carpenter. And now looking back, it feels as much like a John Carpenter film as anything else he has done. And one of those reasons why is I love the title sequences. I love the music. Of course, John Carpenter is a very hands-on movie maker, so he designed the music himself. It's very deliberate, it's very catchy, and it's simplistic. It's basically the catchiest type of tune you can make without going full on in depth and having a big orchestra or anything like that. It's just it's synthesized and it's to the point. It's very raw. But I'll set it up for you here. What you've got is Jamie Lee Curtis. She's very young in this and she plays Laurie Strode. And then you have Donald Pleasance and he plays Dr. Loomis. Then you have a couple of supporting actresses that are really good in this, including Nancy Loomis, PJ Soles, and so on and so on. But that's the main people I want to talk about mostly is Donald Pleasance and Jamie Lee Curtis, and then, of course, John Carpenter. And then the character himself of Michael Myers or The Shape. I would say that for this first movie, those are the four things you want to talk about that defines this movie. Now, for this movie, it's considered by many to be the starting point of a lot of slashers. It's not obviously the first. In fact, there was a lot of slashers that came right before this that were very influential, but this is the one that set the tone because it's the one that made the most amount of money. I think they said something to the effect that it made 200 times how much it cost to make the movie, which is amazing. That's a phenomenal thing, and this was the most successful independent movie up until maybe the 90s or something like that. I want to say that it could have been up until the Blair Witch Project, but I'm not for sure on that. But what you've got is the beginning is very, very strange. I think the beginning of this movie sets the tone very well, which you have this person. You are the killer as the camera, and the camera puts on a mask, and the camera goes through and commits a murder, and then it's very robotic and it's very creepy. But then as the camera kind of moves on and as you see outside of that first person perspective, you realize this is a 6-year-old boy that commits this murder. And that's the setup of the movie. That's the first couple of minutes. Then what you get is a flash forward from, I believe, 1963 to 1978. And it's basically right before Halloween. And this is a movie about babysitters that are in that neighborhood where that original boy was from. And that boy, who is now a grown man, he's like 21 years old or something like that, that man returns home. And when he returns back to his city of Haddonfield, Illinois, he begins to stalk these babysitters that are in this neighborhood on Halloween night. And then that's basically the main setup of the movie. But it is kind of a slow burn. There isn't a lot of gore in this movie. A lot of people remember gore in this, but if you actually go back, most of the murders you see are very dark. There's not as much blood as you can imagine in your head. And the killer in this is referred to often as the Shape, and that's mostly through credits. Through the rest of the time, they don't really talk about him by name hardly at all. But he is Michael Myers, the patient of Dr. Loomis. And Dr. Loomis, he was there when the child went to the hospital. Along the way, became the caregiver of the child. So when he returns home, it is up to Dr. Loomis to hunt down his patient and return him back to the mental hospital. And during this time, you've got a lot of cat and mouse. As he's stalking these babysitters that are divided up in this one neighborhood, he is also building a scare, if you will, for Laurie Strode. The murdered victims, he's hiding in weird places. He's bringing artifacts to the house to set up as almost like a haunted house is what it seems like there towards the end. And when you get down to the end, the showdown between Laurie Strode and Michael Myers, that's kind of what has started the trend of the strong female character versus the killer. And in that one, you can see where all of that kind of began. This being one of those movies that are very influential. I can't say that I ever remember very many movies where there was a strong, singular female character that kind of gained strength as the movie moved along and that eventually was prepared for a showdown. But that's kind of what happens. And then Dr. Loomis kind of sweeps in at the very end to give like the final 1-2 punch to kind of get Laurie Strode out of the location where Michael Myers has got her trapped. And then Laurie Strode evades the killer to survive, and so does Dr. Loomis, but so does the Shape, so does Michael Myers. After being shot, he falls to the ground, and then they discover later he is left. And that kind of leaves you at the end of Halloween. I believe I was in 4th grade when I very first saw Halloween on VHS, and it scared me so bad. And at that time, I couldn't really imagine that a movie from the 1970s could scare me. Because at that time, movies from the 70s seemed old, and even though it was the 1980s, we weren't even 10 years later. And I really just didn't expect to be that scared. And honestly, I was scared to death. And one of the things that scared me the most, besides the music, which was a big part of it, was that the killer was never actually caught. He seemed unstoppable, and the movie ends with no resolution. And I think that's probably the thing that stuck with me the most, is that walking away knowing that he's out there somewhere. So now that you've seen Halloween, and how could I not talk about Halloween on Halloween? Something else that kind of deals with that. And today I want to talk about this specific set, which is Halloween 25 Years of Terror. This was put out in 2006. You could probably still find it. This was at Walmart for as cheap as $3 or $5 just like a year ago. So you might be able to still find this really cheap. This particular one is a 2-disc set. I don't know if they're all 2-disc sets or not. Mine is one of the ones that came out when they very first came out, but I do know this is out there. It also comes on this set. If you have this set, you can get the single disc version, but you don't get as much bonus material. But what I like about this is, if you're a really big fan of Halloween, this definitely kind of draws them all together and kind of builds up the necessary momentum you need to get motivated about watching the entire series. That's what I did. I watched Halloween and then I watched this to kind of get myself in the mood. And what I liked is the interesting way that they dissected the little movies and made certain things important and what they did right, what they did wrong, and everything else. And even though I'd seen all these movies, this is what made me really interested. So I definitely recommend that. It's definitely big for people that enjoy like Never Sleep Again or the Jason documentary that they did for Friday the 13th. It's right along that, and it's got like 3 or 4 hours of bonus features. It's really, really great for the money. Now we're going to talk about my actual bonus section, which on the bonus section, since we're doing the franchise fest, I'm just going to go ahead and move on to the second movie, and then we'll take a break for the next day. But on the second movie, I want to talk about Halloween 2. This just came out recently by Scream Factory. This is the slipcover, which is the original, and this is the alternate cover, which I prefer this one. This is what reminds me of a kid, watching Halloween 2, is that with the skull and the pumpkin. And if I could say that something that, stood out for me in Halloween 1 was the music, this one, what stands out is the opening credits. I really like that really slow, zoom that goes into the pumpkin, and then the pumpkin opens and there's a skull inside. That to me is amazing. I really enjoy it. There's something creepy about it. In HD, it loses a little bit. For the first time ever, I noticed how bad that skull is that's inside the pumpkin. It just doesn't look like a skull at all. I have such fond memories of watching this on VHS, on very small TVs, and it just always creeped me out a little bit more than it does now. But I still think it's a great shot. I love it. The formula for Halloween 2 is not that different from Halloween 1. In fact, even though this came out a few years later, it picks up on the same night, picks up on Halloween night, 1978. And what you get is you get Laurie. She's transported to the hospital. Dr. Loomis is still working with the police, still trying to track down Michael Myers, the Shape. And at this point, it kind of seems like Dr. Loomis is going crazy because none of the police believe that he has shot Michael Myers, even though he had. And the whole town seems to be on edge. There's a lot of really weird scenes where there's an overreaction by the people. Especially there's a scene where the police just barrel through town and hit this guy that they think might be Michael Myers. And he just is pinned between a car and just burns up. And that wasn't even intentional. That was just a police officer driving crazy through the streets of this town on Halloween night, which I always thought was very, very odd because it's like he came out of nowhere. And I mean, it's like the most horrific accident ever. And in the middle of that, the people just leave. They don't even stick around to try to put out the fire. It's like they're just like, oh, we got a call. They found another body. They start to discover the other victims from the Halloween 1 movie. And they just all jump in this other cop car and leave. This one cop that's there with this burning body. It's very odd. It's almost off-putting to the point where you almost got to pause the movie and scratch your head. But this movie, as it moves from the babysitter in a babysitting house over to a hospital, you also see that the focus of the killer kind of changes. He's now moving into a hospital, and it feels a lot less like being Halloween. Even though it is Halloween, you only get a few initial things at the very beginning that have to do with Halloween. You get a little boy that shows up at a hospital and he has bitten into some candy or an apple or something, and he's got a razor blade, and which reminds me a lot of all the urban legends and everybody's fearful mother telling you not to, eat certain things on Halloween back in the 80s. But you've got those things, and then you've got him, you've got Michael Myers kind of going door to door, looking in the windows and stuff like that. And that kind of feels like that was part of the original one, but once it moves over to the actual hospital, it feels very different. The victims all start turning into ambulance drivers, they're nurses, they're hospital administrators. It's a very different crowd of people that are kind of victims for the killer. Laurie spends most of this, the Jamie Lee Curtis character, Laurie spends most of this in her bed, which is odd because it seems like all this stuff's going on around her and she's kind of not involved. But she is basically injured, and they take her into the hospital and they put her under to do a few things for her, and she, even against her will, she decides that she finally just gives in. And they kind of just forget about her. There's a lot going on before you get back to the Laurie versus Michael Myers showdown. And Donald Pleasance kind of eventually figures out where the focus is, and he comes back, and you get a very similar showdown, although this time it's more finalized. What you get is you get Jamie Lee Curtis's character in a room with the Shape, and then what you get is Donald Pleasance kind of sweeping in again to try to save Jamie Lee Curtis's character. And what happens is this time it seems like there's a little bit more forethought into making sure Michael Myers doesn't survive. And it's done by both the studio and it's done by the characters. It's very strange to watch, but they actually end up burning Michael Myers. They set off a whole bunch of gas canisters. There's ether, there's oxygen, there's a whole bunch of things in this room, in this hospital. And they basically set fire to it. And this is after Michael Myers has been shot a few more times, and he still seems to be unable to die. But what you appear to have is Jamie Lee Curtis surviving again, but it appears to be the death of Dr. Loomis, Donald Pleasance's character, and the Shape, Michael Myers. And you kind of leave on this very strange note it's not like the first one. This movie, the formula seems very similar until the very end. And then you're kind of surprised that they just show the Michael Myers character burning. He's just kind of there. It's like he had a little bit of life in him. He took a few steps, he fell, and then he just sat there and burned. And that's kind of it. It's just like Jamie Lee Curtis gets in another ambulance and kind of just gets swept away. And you feel like maybe they're going to come back with a Halloween 3 where she's been transported to another hospital. Halloween 2 is ultimately... It's very faithful to the original, and yet that's kind of what makes it not stand out in its own special way. It's just a good sequel. It's not as great as the original, and it doesn't do anything to make the hardcore fans angry. So it's just a good sequel. That's how I would put it. It feels like you can see the budget a little bit more on the screen, and obviously the deaths kind of benefit more from this little bit of a higher budget. It's a little bit gorier. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that. And I will briefly say, after I spoke about the first one, I showed you this, there is another version of Halloween 2 that was put out by Universal. This one is about basically the same as the Scream Factory one. If you've seen this, there's no real reason to get this unless, of course, you're trying to get Terror in the Aisles. That documentary is a great documentary. It was a feature film that was actually released back in the 80s. It's got a whole host of different things going on in it. It shows you both people like Donald Pleasance hosting it, but it also shows you a whole bunch of movies that are kind of forgotten to time. So if you're really big into horror documentaries, I recommend Terror in the Aisles, especially since this has been out of print for a long time. The artifacting on some of this is really bad, but most of that's because of the source material they use inside the documentary. The documentary itself has been cleaned up, but it's as clean as they can make it, considering that they borrowed from like 40 or 50 different movies, and some of those, the copies had a lot of dirt and specks and stuff on it, and you can't really clean that because it's a copy of a copy, you know what I mean? But Terror in the Aisles is the whole reason to get this. It's an exclusive to this. I believe they are going to release that on DVD, but it's going to be like DVD-R for the Universal Vault. So for today, I'm going to leave it at that. We talked about Halloween and Halloween 2. These are a little bit longer, and I'm going to try to knock out 2 of these on each of them so that we can move at a better pace. Obviously, I'll probably have something less to say about some of the others, but here in the now, I would just like to kind of knock out the first 2 with a little bit more explanation, and I think they're the strongest ones in the series by far, and then we'll just move on from here. I'll go ahead and leave you guys at that, and I will see you guys again tomorrow for my Franchise Fest, where we will talk about Halloween 3 and a couple of other things. All right, see you guys again tomorrow. All right, bye.